أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمخلوقين سيدنا ونبينا وشفينا أبي القاسم محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم بسم الله القاسم الجبارين إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون رضا بقضائي وتسليما لأمري. Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum. This is the final session which I have prepared for this Muharram. When I started to think about this subject, I felt that maybe 5 sessions would be enough. But I think there's a lot more material than which we can handle in 5 sessions. And I've left out big chunks, which hopefully, if Allah gives life and ability, we will tackle in some future occasions. In particular, I wanted to mention the rise of the Fatimids in North Africa, especially. At one time from Egypt up to the borders of Algeria. As the name indicates, the Fatimids, of course, were also followers of the Ahlul Bayt and lovers of Ahlul Bayt, and established that empire, Fatimid empire, in the name of the Ahlul Bayt. Like some of us may know, but it's good to just put forward that these were the people who established the city of Cairo. The name of Cairo actually is Kahira, it's victory. And these were the people who actually established the Jamiat al-Azhar, the University of Azhar. So Azhar originally was established by the lovers of Ahlul Bayt. And that is why we will see towards the end of today that Azhar still retains a capacity to work with followers of Ahlul Bayt, as opposed to other universities like the University of Medina and so on, which find it difficult to work with other schools. But unfortunately, we didn't have time to cover that. That itself would have taken a full lecture, and then we would not have been able to finish what we wanted to finish. Even today, we have a quite tight timetable. So I want to try to make sure that we put it as succinctly as we can. The first item, the first topic, if you like, we want to tackle today is this idea of the commemoration of Muharram itself. If you remember, in the first session, I alluded to the fact that because of the control over information and because of the tight control over information and prohibition of doing anything, which brought the Umayyad regime into disrepute, the only way in which this hold, this reign of fear can be broken was the practice initiated by Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam and the family of Imam Hussein alayhi salam to start mourning ceremonies, beginning with their prison cell and then on. These small circles in which they used to sit and mourn could not be stopped, but were developed into kind of communication sessions in which the events of Kerbala were communicated to a small number of people, and they were encouraged to hold similar gatherings in their own houses and towns, so that if you see, in a matter of time, slowly the message will spread, and it became quite widely known in a short space of time what had happened in Kerbala. Otherwise, the control over the situation was such that it would be difficult for people to find out. And clearly this practice kept on through the Umayyad period, trying to breach the reign of oppression and censorship, and of course developed further as time went on. The first reported official, if you like, mourning ceremony and ziyarah or visitation to the haram or to the grave of the Imam is reported. I mean, individuals may have been there, but in a collective session, it is reported to be by the Tawwabun. Remember, we mentioned these people with Suleiman as their leader, who took 3 years after the event of Kerbala to mobilize themselves and decided to fight the killers of Imam Hussein. Before proceeding to battle, they actually went to Kerbala and spent 3 days there in remembering, praying, and mourning. So this is the first reported, if you like, practice of visiting and, of course, mourning for the Imam. From there, it proceeds in different eras and times. We have seen that in some times the followers of Ahlul Bayt were free, relatively free to do what they wanted to do, and then at other times they were not so free, so they had to be careful and so on. And we saw lots of other times, like the Safavi times, when it was the official religion of the state, so there would not be any restriction. Some of the Awadh states, Nawab states in India, where of course also they were Shi'i states, so there would not be any problem. And with the rise of Baghdad, the status of Najaf and Karbala in Hilla became slightly more relaxed, because they were not then central to the administration of Iraq. And during the Ottoman rule, which is for most of the period, they were, and of course the Abbasid rule, as we saw, there were times when it was possible to do quite a lot, and there were other times when it was not possible to do much. But by all accounts, these mourning sessions and ziyarah sessions remained relatively low-key and were mainly used by the followers of Ahlul Bayt to remind themselves, to help them to renew their understanding and renew their intent, not later on to avenge the killing of Imam Hussein or anything, but to see if they could renew their intent to follow the example of Imam Hussein in bringing justice. It is only much, much later that different kinds of ceremonies started to emerge depending on the location. So, for example, as we saw in Safavi Iran, now that the whole state had become Shi'i, there isn't any restriction on what you could do. There isn't any danger as well that these things or these memories will not be allowed. So there evolved what are now known as very, very elaborate tazia or passion plays, or similar to what we would call a theater in which the events of Karbala were reenacted. Now, you see, if you look at the function of theater or plays in different cultures, you will see that it has a number of angles. Sometimes you use theater to say things which you cannot say openly. So you hint at what is going on. Sometimes you use theater to remind yourselves of key points in history and key events or key moral lessons. And sometimes you use theater just to promote what has happened. And you can see this in all kinds of performances where you observe this in different cultures. Similarly, in Safavi Iran, this theater or this reenactment, if you like, of the events of Karbala achieved a very, very high standard. They became quite significant events in the calendar of the people. Different towns, different locations had their own version, very elaborate theaters. Of course, because this was an occasion for mourning, it wasn't like a festivity. It was more mourning, and there was, of course, remembrance, and there was recitations and compositions on the tragedy of Karbala and so on. But there was very little in these things, what we would call matam, or even what you would call the use of any zanjeers or swords or anything like that in those theater plays. It was more gatherings and reenactments. As other cultures drew into it, and sometimes people, of course, started to visit Najaf and Karbala, and they brought their own ways of mourning into the picture. However, by all known accounts, it doesn't seem that until the 1800s or mid-1800s, there has been any use of metal or, swords or zanjeers for mourning of Imam Hussein. It's only then when this practice was brought by certain groups from north of Iran and Caspian Sea and the Central Asian countries, which were practices in some of the groups and some of the peoples there for mourning. And they started to bring this to Najaf and Karbala. Iran has relatively less of this. So once this practice is started, there was a big controversy whether it was permissible to harm oneself in the process of commemorating the ceremonies. And here we get two very opposing trends amongst the scholars. There is one early report from a scholar called Ibn Shalal. He says that it is permissible to flagellate for Hussein's sake and to mourn his death in any manner, even if the flagellant knows that he would die on account of it. And then later on, kind of rumor spread that he had written this with a pen which he got from Imam Ali during a dream. So, it assumes a aura of sacredness, saying this is how, and this doesn't matter, you can do whatever you want. However, by 1895, when this practice was gaining ground there, and obviously other zawars to the shrines took it back to their own places, Ayatollah Shirazi, whom we mentioned yesterday, who was the main person who gave the fatwa against the tobacco monopoly, he expressly prohibited it. He said, this is not allowed, full stop. It is not permissible and should be stopped. Later on, two very, very prominent mujtahids, Sayyid Abul Hasan Isfahani in Najaf and Sayyid Muhammad Mehdi in Qazwin, Sayyid Muhammad Mehdi Qazwini in Basra, also gave rulings against this practice. Sheikh Mohsin al-Amin in Damascus was also a prominent mujtahid, also gave a ruling against it. So you can see now there are two opposing camps, and then later on, people from the family and circle of Kashif al-Ghita, another big scholar, said, no, it's okay to carry on this practice. So there is a to and fro. At the same time, in some other places, like India of that time, some of the local ways of mourning were incorporated into the practice of commemoration. So you can see some of the practices of how you perform the matam and so on resemble very much some of the folk rituals of those areas. This is only natural that people would mourn in a way which they understand from their culture. What is becoming and becomes problematic is that some of these things then become or attain an aura of sacredness and say this is sacred to mourn like this. Whereas from all known facts which we have until late, there is no one way of mourning. Mourning specifically was designed to really break the stranglehold of the Umayyad and later Abbasid control of information. And so we have to keep that in mind when we consider what kind of mourning ceremonies and what kind of mourning ceremonies are appropriate in different times and different locations. There isn't one way and there isn't one sacred way or blessed way. There are many ways. In fact, the central idea has always been that we find some medium, as you see with the development of the taziyas in Iran, to communicate these ideas the happenings in a way which people can relate to and refresh their, commitment to the mission. The other bit which joins with this is that sometimes, in order to make people mourn, there have been a lot of embellishments to the narrative of Karbala. So lots of stories have been added, which many of them do not have any substantial or solid backing. And this subject was tackled by Ayatollah Murtaza Mutahari in one of his books. I think about 15, 18 years ago, we published that book from here. And he puts forward this idea and picks up lots of embellishments and says that these are all not actually part of the historical record. Some of the reciters of Muharram, they argue that it is okay to embellish the stories to make the believers mourn properly. But Ayatollah Mutahari says it is not okay. One should be careful so that one is closer to the actual narrative. And he argues that the actual events themselves are sufficiently sad to not need any kind of embellishment. So if we try to park these two things, the form of the mourning and also the content of the majalis or the roza or roza khani or whatever you call it, both need to be watched carefully and tailored to time rather than adhered to just because somebody has brought some embellishment, then it becomes part of the narrative. And then we have lots of disputes, you see, in India, in Iran, in Lebanon. When some of these embellishments are challenged, you can have quite serious conflicts. But that probably, inshallah, we'll take up at some other stage. The second point we want to take up today is this question of now what to do as followers of Ahlul Bayt in the Gaiba of the Imam. We saw that we reached a stage, of course, during Safavi times when the state and Ulama worked together. The Ulama actually legitimized the state. Post-Safavi times, and we saw, the last thing we saw yesterday was that although the Ulama had withdrawn and taken the stance of being the moral guardians of society, some of the things happening in society, like this tobacco concession, were so big that the ulama were forced to come back to the front and say, we want to interfere in this business. And the success over the tobacco concession also brought to the front this whole debate as to what to do now. And around the turn of the 20th century, a debate started in Iran primarily and in the theological centers as to what kind of government was permissible in the absence of the Imam. One of the more perceptive and one of the more, if you like, very well thought through ideas on this subject came from Ayatollah Muhammad Hussain Naini. Ayatollah Naini, in his Tanbih, put forward the idea like this. He said, there is no doubt that any government in the absence of the Imam is illegitimate. The only question now remaining is how to make it as less harmful and as detrimental to the followers of Ahlul Bayt as possible. And so he argued for establishing a constitutional check on power. That we should have a constitutional regime in which power, including the ruler, will be subject to the constitution. And this came to be known as the Mashrute, or Mashrute means shurut, from shurut in Farsi means conditions or constitutional clauses. Other ulama that time argued that we do not need this kind of constitutions. The Sharia is enough for us. So they called and argued for a mashru'e. So it was mashrute versus mashru'e. The debate raged on because obviously after that crisis of Nasser Ali, Shah and the tobacco concession, something needed to be done to protect the interests of the believers. And finally, it resulted in a constitutional revolution in 1906 in Iran, where there was a constitutional check on power. But there was one big concession to the side which argued for the Sharia. They established a council of guardians composed of mujtahideen or jurists who would endorse any legislation as Islamic or not. Any legislation would have to be endorsed by them. So it was a positive power given to them to say any legislation will have to be Islamic or not. Whilst this thing was being played out, obviously other things happened, and then the whole thing was scrapped when Raza Shah took over as the Pahlavi king and abolished all these things and took power himself. And then obviously he proceeded to crack down on the ulama and the scholars in a very, very savage manner. He said, we don't want anything to do with religion. In fact, he wanted to proceed very similar to Kemal Ataturk in Egypt. So those you know, Ataturk, sorry? Yeah, sorry, not Egypt, Turkey, I'm sorry. Yeah, so Ataturk did two things, one slightly more dangerous than the other. The first one was he abolished the Khilafat. See, on the Sunni side, the line had continued in the form of caliphs, and the Ottoman caliphs were in at least, if you like, power, even nominal power. So he abolished it. He said, we don't need this. But more than that, he said, we want to become Europeans, and therefore we should wear European dress, and more importantly, we changed the script of Turkish into Latin script. So after that time, Turkish language has been written in Latin script. That means that the Turkish people lost their link with their own history. Because now the Turkish people, very few of them can read Turkish in the Arabic script as it was written before. Raza Khan had a similar idea. He wanted to change the Persian script into Latin. He wanted, and still there is in Iran, if you like, Western dress being pushed. Wearing of the Iranian version of hijab, chador, was banned. And women were really persecuted for wearing it, if they did. And the state became formally a secular dictatorship. Now, of course, the ulama, our job is just to look at the ulama bit, were thrown into quite a difficult situation. And they continued their opposition, but the space for action was much more limited. As things go, he sided with Hitler in the Second World War. And so, of course, he became enemy of the other side. And he was deposed and replaced by his son. In fact, he was exiled to South Africa, and his grave is still near Johannesburg. So, of course, the new Raza Shah Pahlavi was weak in the beginning, and situation was changing. And also within Iran, people began to find ways of opposing until a time when Mossadegh came to power as prime minister, and he proceeded to nationalize the oil of Iran. At that time, most of the oil was, and the oil wells, especially in Abadan and that region, were owned by a company called Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This company today is called British Petroleum. The origin of that company is Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Mossadegh argued that this was a national resource. This is not an English resource. We need to nationalize it. And now here, of course, you will see, we don't have time, but you will see the information. If you look at the reportage of that time, you will see that probably Mossadegh has done something very, very bad, very uncivilized, very barbaric, and he needs to be thrown out. And indeed, both the United States and Britain mobilized and staged a coup in 1953 to remove him and bring the Shah back. The ulama also, of course, partly supported Mossadegh and had quite a significant role in some points in time, and then, of course, other involvement later. But this opened the channels for thinking as to what is to be done. Eventually, theological thinking came to the idea that there was no solution in working with another ruler, either Safavid or Shah or whatever. And that is where, in his exile in Najaf, Imam Khamenei came with this idea that really, in this time of Gaiba, the ulama, the scholars, or the possessors of knowledge had the authority to actually rule in the name of the Imam. So he formulated his ideas in a series of lectures which he termed Hukumat-e-Islami, Islamic government. These ideas began to gain ground, and the oppression which continued actually encouraged a lot of other scholars in Iran to mobilize, eventually, as we know, succeeding in the revolution in 1979 in Iran. So that's now about 35 years. However, we see that that still does not solve the whole problem. And there are a number of issues with this formulation which we will still await historical developments to take place. For example, in the present constitution, most of the power, if you like, or sovereign power, rests with the Wali Faqih, who is, of course, the guardian Faqih. Constitutionally, and naturally, if you think about it, this Wali does not need to be Iranian. Can be anybody from anywhere who is qualified. Under him, the president and the parliament, yes, the president has to be Iranian, the parliament is fine. But the Wali, not necessarily so. So that's one issue. Tomorrow, if the most qualified person is outside Iran, does that mean that the whole of the Iranian politics is in the hand of somebody who is outside? The second issue is that the definition of the Wali, initially it was being thought of as very close to what you would identify as marja taqlid, or the highest authority to emulate. After Imam Khamenei, this definition has shifted into somebody who is a qualified mujtahid, but probably politically more aware, and that has become much more important than otherwise. There's a third issue which emerged 2 years ago, 3 years ago in Iran. That if people inside disagree with the government, then what happens? As many of you may know, there was a lot of disquiet around the last election, not the one in which Rouhani was elected, but before, the second time when Ahmadinejad was elected. And the opposition now wanted to mobilize in the name of Imam Hussein. And the government want to crack down on them in the name of Imam Hussein. So you see the dilemma. We're not here looking at who is right or wrong, but you see that this dilemma still is not solved. So there are still loose ends here, which hopefully will evolve towards some kind of governance which meets the needs of the followers of Ahlul Bayt, at least in countries like Iran, where a large majority of the population is following the madhab of Ahlul Bayt. In Iraq, it forms a different problem. Although we saw that Iraq is now a majority Shi'i country, but still there are significant minorities. And the ulama in Iraq are not as disposed to agree with the formulation of governance of Imam Khamenei. They are still thinking and feeling that they should be only moral guardians of society rather than directly involved in society. And you see from the rulings of Ayatollah Sistani over the last 5 years or 10 years that many times he has been pushed quite close to the edge. The first time when the constitution of the country was being written, he had to interfere to put down that the principle of one man, one vote could not be violated. There was an idea by Mr. Bremer, who was the American person in charge there, to try to see if he could play around and somehow reduce the power of the Shi'i majority. The last time, a few months ago, when this ISIS problem grew up, again you see Adla Sistani coming to the front and said it is now mandatory to fight this. This is even more than a state verdict in terms of its implications. So you can see that the ulama are grappling with a correct formulation of what is the right position to adopt in the absence of the imam, because obviously, as we saw, there is no timeline as to when the ghaiba will be over and when the imam will come. The imam comes, there won't be hopefully any problem of this kind. There will be other problems, but not of theological thought. So this evolution in theological thought towards how far the ulama can go starts from the time of the ghaiba, where there was an idea that perhaps they should only restrict themselves to reporting what was received from the imams and spreading that, to then interpreting it, then taking charge of society, then taking leadership of society. This is quite a significant evolution. All, of course, in the name of the Ahlul Bayt. This is not now looking at other societies, right? But as I said, this is still very much work in progress. The final thing we want to look at today, and this is of relevance to us today, is the growth in sectarian discourse. As we are aware from recent events, that one of the main thrusts of opposition is now not against non-Muslims or outsiders. It's against the followers of Ahlul Bayt, saying that this is the first problem. So for ISIS, the Shia are the first problem. They don't care about the others outside. And so their focus is on there. So where did this start? Unfortunately, obviously, there was this thinking, and we have seen how Karbala and Najaf have been attacked a few times by fanatical Salafis who argue that these practices are not valid and so on. But this has been sporadic and nothing serious. But beginning with the 1970s, a new kind of linkage has emerged. And it's a new geopolitical development. With the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and the American concern with the rise of communism, this became a focal point in the challenge after, of course, Vietnam was finished. And they started to fund a lot of opposition in Afghanistan through Pakistan. The Saudis provided the money and the Americans provided the arms. And they created what we now know as the Taliban. In fact, if you go back and read your reports of that time, you will see that the rise of the Taliban and the spread of the Taliban in taking over Afghanistan exactly parallels the rise and spread of ISIS today in terms of its speed and suddenness and so on. However, when the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, both the Saudis and the Americans were of the opinion that the Islamic Revolution presented a big threat. And they continued this program to put pressure on Iran. Obviously, the Americans, it is still difficult to figure out whether they understood this thing or they didn't understand. If they didn't understand then, this time they would understand. So what they have done this time shows that probably they did understand what they were doing. If you allow the Saudis to fund, they're not just going to write their checkbooks. They're going to influence who is getting the money and who is fighting. And they created this whole fitna in Pakistan where the Taliban grew up. And now we have a problem in Afghanistan and we have a problem in Pakistan itself. The whole culture in Pakistan has been poisoned. Not only against the Shiis, also against other people who don't toe the Saudi line. In fact, for example, 3-4 years ago, I remember, there was a group which was celebrating the birthday of the Prophet, which is considered to be a big bid'ah in Wahhabi thinking. And the whole stage was blown up. 50 scholars who had gathered to give talks were blown up there. None of them was Shia. All of them from different parts of Pakistan society. So this continued, and the Americans, seemed only to wake up when they saw what happened on 9/11. And then they cracked down on the Taliban and tried to push them back. And to this day, they haven't managed this. They're now in a situation where they want to talk to the Taliban and say, fine, let's come to some agreement and go on. As long as you can keep Iran on its toes on this side. So this geopolitical linkage between Saudi and US is based on one central American requirement that time, and that is for access to oil. Because America was importing maybe 60% of its oil requirement then, and Saudi Arabia was the key supplier. So they said, their foreign policy says anything which we can do to keep that, we will do. Doesn't matter what they do in their own time and money. Otherwise, you can imagine that if 11 or 12 out of the 19 people who were accused of masterminding the 9/11, 12 were Saudis. You think if today that happens to any other country, the Americans will leave that country alone and work with that? No. So there was this understanding. In a similar way, this, and in fact, if we have time, you should read a book called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim by Professor Mahmoud Mamdani. And he traces this question of the nurturing of Taliban. In fact, Taliban leaders were invited by Reagan to his office, and he compared them to the founding fathers of America. And this is documented. It's not something which is hidden. However, having learnt or not learnt from that, they go and do the same thing in Syria. Started to fund all kinds of groups, encourage all kinds of groups to come, arm them with Saudi and Gulf money again, and then show very surprised that they have moved much more than they thought they would. I don't think this is by default. It has to be by design. Again, Saudi money came with Saudi ideology. And you see slowly that Syrian opposition evolving into an anti-Shi'i ideology rather than anything else. And what we see in, of course, Iraq and Syria at the moment is that. So to end, there are two developments here which probably give us a little bit of hope as to how things will evolve from here on for the followers of Ahlul Bayt. The first one, a very important one in the medium term, is that the American need for Saudi oil is getting less. The discovery of the process to extract shale oil has already reduced the US need for Saudi oil to half. This frightens two countries in a very significant way. One, obviously, Saudi Arabia, because now the Saudis know that the Americans, push comes to shove, may not care what happens to us. They leave us alone. That's why you will see them jumping up and down every time the Americans want to talk to Iran or so on. Secondly, to Israel. Because Israel also knows that if the Americans don't need Middle Eastern oil, they don't care what happens in the Middle East. And they will not spend that much time in defending it. So they will not be as friendly to barbaric ethnic cleansing in Palestine as they were before. And you see signs of that. So these developments over the next 5 years opens another window in which the space for challenging Wahhabi ideology will become much more possible because the Saudis will be on the back foot. They won't be now supported by Americans. The second thing is that in this process, the Saudis and the Salafis have also taken battle within the Sunni community with the Akhwan al-Muslimin, with the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, after the events in Egypt, the Brotherhood has been made into a terrorist or branded as a terrorist organization. And so they are equal to whatever other enemies the Saudis may have. And the Brotherhood has got a much more broader view of Islam. And it is possible to open a dialogue with them, to create a common front which is pan-Islamic and emphasize points of commonality rather than points of difference between us. So if we manage to exploit that opportunity, then I think there are possibilities of reducing the sectarian discourse in a very significant way. In fact, you see that in post-revolution Iran, with the confidence the country had much more possibility of opening a dialogue with the other Muslims. So 2 or 3 pronouncements of Imam Khamenei are quite relevant here. First, he promoted what is now known as Hafte Wahdat. This is the week of unity, which extends from 12th to the 17th of Rabiul Awwal. As you know, many people think that the birthday of the Prophet is on the 12th of Rabiul Awwal. We have 17th, so that whole week. He put forward, let us call this the week of unity and find common points. He started the idea of one day in a year to be named as the day for Quds, liberation of Quds, of Jerusalem from Israel. Again, a very common point. He started the idea and put forward very forcefully that when we are in common gatherings, especially in Makkah and Medina, we should observe Jamaa prayers for the majority, with the majority there. You can see now that the very exclusive sectarian discourse of the previous Safavi times and others is now being slowly challenged here and saying, no, that's not the way to go. This is a different way to go. So, in this new situation emerging, we have the possibility, probably, of creating a broader front against the likes of ISIS. And remember that a lot of that will have to come from our Sunni brothers. Because without that support, we cannot defeat it on our own. You can see what happened in Iraq, that if you don't have that support on the ground, you can lose ground very, very quickly. So to sum up for our session today, we see that the challenge post-Kerbala has always been how to grow and preserve the distinct entity which follows the line. The Iranian term is very, very nice, path, if you like, of Imam Hussein in terms of creating justice and drawing a line against injustice, whichever society one is in. Of course, in minority societies like here, you will have to fight injustice in other ways. In Muslim societies, injustice in some other ways. And the ulama themselves, and of course, scholars, have evolved their ideas as to how far we could take morality into governance. And this is still an unfinished project. And finally, of course, changes in geopolitics means that the support which the Wahhabis have had over the last 30 years, 40 years from the Americans is unlikely to last in that form. So hopefully we have chances to do other things. Assalamu alaikum.
Okay, so I think we've got time for maybe one question on each side. Who wants to go first?
I was just wondering, the preachers, when they recite in Muharram, why do they recite things like exaggerate? I mean, where our children are, I mean, when the children listen to all that, where is it good, what are they going to gain by that?
It's a good question. As Shaykh Mutari says, I mean, this is not new, it is old. We're talking of 1979 or 78. That some of these things take the aura of sacredness and then it's difficult to remove them. And when you say to them, look, this is not in the narrative, this is exaggeration. But in the nature of things, once they get into folk discourse, it becomes difficult to remove, difficult to challenge, and can create lots of violence, which it has in some parts. We have to just keep at it.
Is there anyone else in the...
Assalamualaikum. You covered a vast period of time, 1,300 years, and you gave a lot of detail on the sectarianism since the 70s. And then looking back, I see Kerbala as a form of that similar sectarianism in terms of um, beliefs and so on. Was there any more between in that 1300 years? Or was everyone just left on their own to get on with it and the Shiaism grew?
No, I think the original point of departure of Karbala was really the, if you like, nature of the Umayyad regime, right? So after the problems with Muawiyah, there have been several problems. A person has succeeded as caliph who is not practicing, okay, visibly. It's not like even pretending. And to embed that would have been a disaster, especially if that person is asking for your allegiance, right? If he leaves you alone, you could always continue your own path with your whatever number of followers you have. But if he forces you to say that this is the rightful way in which the community will be governed, then you have to draw a line somewhere. And that is where the line was drawn in Karbala, right? Now, subsequent to that, if that line was maintained, and I don't know if you were here when we had the session from the Sheikh from Harrow Mosque, that line is quite easy to be agreed upon by the wider Muslim community. If you now go and extend that argument to other periods earlier, in a similar, where the kind of structure was very different, it wasn't now a non-practicing person as ruler or something, right? Then you are removing the boundaries of understanding between different groups. And if you push further and make that as your main discourse, rather than the events of Karbala and the Umayyads, then you are obviously looking for trouble. So that has gone through seesaws, and now, as I said, with the Islamic Republic, it is beginning to draw back, but it's proving to be quite challenging.
Okay, final question from Nizar Uncle.
I think you also concluded that the mourning is taught to us by our fourth Imam, Sadiq alayhi salam. The concept of mourning has to continue, no matter which part of the world you are in, which cultural background you have. My question is that we who have come to the Western world the last 50, 60, 70 years, we really, so I'm asking everybody here to start thinking, we really have to try and adapt the methodology of mourning befitting the society that we live in. So this young lad sitting on my laps, is he going to mourn the same way that the Iranians mourn, or the Indians mourn, or the East Africans mourn? And this is what we have to think. Just like we dropped the concept of minara and the dome from our Salam Center architectural side, we have to try and really think laterally. How are we going to mourn in this society that befits and perhaps helps communicate with the local society as well?
So I think there are two kind of ways to look at it. One is the role of any commemoration in keeping the knowledge and the purpose of the event live in our own community. Okay? So teaching our children, grandchildren, whatever. That is a function, and that is a mode we will have to find which they accept, Because they might also say, this is boring, and they don't come, then you have a problem. But you have to find a way to engage them. The second question is how to take this message, if you want, or its purpose to the wider community. That's a different thing here than it was anywhere else. And sometimes that's where serious mistakes have been made. As we saw yesterday, just like the Orange Order marches in Ireland, you insist on taking a very divisive and sectarian dialogue into the areas in which people who do not accept live, then you're looking at trouble and you're not really doing a service. If on the other hand you find some way to get people to think as to why you are doing something which they agree with, and I don't know the answer to that, but that is something which we will have to evolve. In Iran, of course, and Iraq and other places where there are majority communities, their main purpose is to keep the narrative alive. It's not to spread it to other people. Okay? Okay, assalamu alaikum.